Hi, this is a message for Wednesday, October the 14th for 11th grade English. And today we're looking at a very specific story in the history of the slave trade. It's the story of the Amistad. The Amistad shows up in the very last part of our poem, middle passage. And so I'm going to teach you about that, and then we'll look at that part of the poem. Before I do, I created another little video that's near this one about how to use the new sentence stem construction. So if you find that you're struggling with the while, even though, and when statements, watch that video. We did it in class. We workshopped someone's in front of everybody, and then I offered some models for your fellow students. So everyone deserves that instruction, including you watching this at home. It's a new construction, and the key thing to take away is the when, even though, and while come at the very beginning of the stem. So we did that for a while. We skipped the poem because of it, and we went straight to the slides. So once in the slides, we're looking at parts 4 and 5, and we're really skipping past part 4, and we'll do it tomorrow, and moving to part 5. Part 5 talks about La Amistad. The Amistad is a ship that was making a voyage from Cuba to another part in Cuba when the African captives on board mutinied, which is the word for somebody taking over the ship. Or in this case, more appropriately, they rebelled and they took back the ship from their captors. As you can see here in this image from this newspaper clipping, July 1839, they were able to kill most of the people who were keeping them captive, and they did so using weapons they found on board. The full story is here. The year was 1839. Portuguese slave traders had gone to Sierra Leone, which is a country in Africa, and they illegally stole Africans. They brought them all the way to Cuba. Why was it illegal? It's always been the case in the slave trade that that's how they got African captives. But the year is really critical to this. In 1808, many countries, including America, made it illegal to steal Africans from their homeland. And instead, they said, using the language of crops, the language of exports, you need to grow your own slaves at your own home. You can no longer import them internationally. So, setting aside for a moment all of the logical fallacies in that law, 30 years later, these Portuguese pirates did exactly what the law said they couldn't do. They brought these captives to Cuba and were moving them to another place in Cuba. In the main hold below the decks, the captives found a rusty file, and they saw it through their manacles, through their cuffs. They quickly went up on deck, attacked the crew, killed most of them, and under the leadership of a man named Cinque, were able to regain control of the ship. They kept 2 men alive so that they could bring them back over to Africa. But the owners that they stole the ship from, they steered the ship up north along the coast of America. And at night, they got closer to America to trick Cinque and his men into thinking they were going back to Africa. So they did finally make it on the land and somewhere in New York, I think Long Island, and they captured these captives again. The captives sued on the grounds that the international slave trade was illegal and had been for 30 years, and that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Their lawyer was John Quincy Adams, who was the 5th president of the United States, but had since left the presidency and was just retiring and finishing out his years as a lawyer. And so they argued this case in front of the Supreme Court. And here are some of the clips of that experience.
officers of the survey brig off the coast of Long Island. Can only assume that the charge is murder.
We do hereby claim salvage on the high seas of the Spanish ship La Amistad and all her cargo.
Your Honor, here are the true owners of these slaves.
These slaves, Your Honor, are by rights the property of Spain.
You and this young so-called lawyer have proven you know what they are. They're Africans. Congratulations. What you don't know is who they are.
This could take us all one long step closer to civil war.
Immediately surrender these goods! Our president has appealed the decision to our Supreme Court. We have to try the case again.
I will call into the past and beg my ancestors to come and help me, for at this moment I am the whole reason they have existed at all.
This is the most important case ever come before this court. Because what it in fact concerns is freedom, the very nature of man. And the proof is the length to which a man will go to regain it once taken. He will break loose his chains. He will decimate his enemies. He will try and try and try against all odds, against all prejudices, to get home.
Okay, so here are some other clips that I recommend you check out. I won't play them all in the interest of time, but it imagines some of the fictional cases that John Quincy Adams could make in front of the Supreme Court to win the Mende people back their freedom. And it sets the stage for the Civil War, 25 years later. So I know we haven't done the Revolution yet, and we will, but it helps you understand how closely all these things are linked. By the Revolution, they're already talking about what are we going to do about slavery. And only 30 years after the Revolution, they're saying, okay, we got to stop slavery. And 30 years after that, they're saying, and now there's going to be a civil war because of this. So it's all part of the same argument around what do we do with this system that we've developed in America. And then this great piece of information that ends victoriously, in a way, the captives won their case. They were allowed to return to Sierra Leone. Unfortunately, by the time they got there, it wasn't exactly this paradise that it might have been in another era. It was ravaged by war and by the slave raids that had been going on. So we're going to read the part of the poem that has to do with the Amistad. Here's your stem. The Mende people won their freedom. When the Mende people won their freedom, even though the Mende people won their freedom, and while the Mende people won their freedom. That's kind of what's guiding your thinking as you go through the poem today. So we're looking at section 5 today, and in section 5, this space over here, I'd like you to use it with a lens for reactions. So kind of tracking what you're thinking and what your emotions might be as you read this. And if you're like me, I needed to read it one time fully and then go back and react. It's difficult to do it at the same time. I'll read the poem here. But for the storm that flung up barriers of wind and wave, the Amistad, Señores, would have reached the port of Principe in 2-3 days at most. But for the storm, we should have been prepared for what befell. Swift as the puma's leap it came. There was that interval of moonless calm, filled only with the waters and the rigging's usual sounds. Then sudden movement, blows and snarling cries, and they had fallen on us with machete and marlin spike. It was as though the very air, the night itself, were striking us. Exhausted by the rigors of the storm, we were no match for them. Our men went down before the murderous Africans. Our loyal Celestino ran from below with gun and lantern, and I saw, before the cane knife's wounding flash, Cinques, that surly brute who calls himself a prince, directing, urging on the ghastly work. He hacked the poor mulatto down, and then he turned on me. The decks were slippery when daylight came. It sickens me to think of what I saw, of how these apes threw overboard the butchered bodies of our men, true Christians all, like so much jetsam. Enough, enough. The rest is quickly told. Cinques was forced to spare the two of us, you see, to steer the ship to Africa, and we, like phantoms doomed to rove the sea, voyaged east by day and west by night. deceiving them, hoping for rescue, prisoners on our own vessel, till at length we drifted to the shores of this, your land, America, where we were freed from our unspeakable misery. Now we demand, good sirs, the extradition of Cinques and his accomplices to La Havana. And it distresses us to know there are so many here who seem inclined to justify the mutiny of these blacks. We find it paradoxical indeed that you whose wealth, whose tree of liberty, are rooted in the labor of your slaves, should suffer the august John Quincy Adams to speak with so much passion of the right of chattel slaves to kill their lawful masters, and with his Roman rhetoric weave a hero's garland for Cinques. I tell you that we are determined to return to Cuba with our slaves, and there see justice done. Cinques, or let us say the prince, Cinques shall die. The deep immortal human wish, the timeless will. Cinques, its deathless primaveral image, life that transfigures many lives. Voyage through death to life upon these shores. The end of the poem. We'll go back, read the whole thing tomorrow in full. So here it is, the Amistad story in poem form. And I'm wanting you to react in this space with your own thoughts, but I'll tell you mine. I get this reaction of indignation, and I think that Hayden is masterful in eliciting that reaction from me, because he's using the slave traders and captors language only, and so you can see the hypocrisy in it. He says here, exhausted by the rigors of the storm, we were no match for these Africans. And I'm indignant, because they've kept the Africans captive in a ship, below deck, in chains, without adequate food and water for many weeks. And they're the ones who are exhausted by the rigors of the storm? What, are the Africans well rested? So I feel myself indignant about that, and I think that's what Hayden is trying to do. And then here, reaction of horror when I see the decks are slippery, because they're slippery with blood. It sickens him, really, to think of what he saw, how these apes threw over the butchered bodies of these Christians. And again, I have anger to call the captives apes when they're just fighting for their lives. I don't discount the horror of having seen all of this. It must have been awful. But to suggest that you're a victim only when you're complicit in such a violent trade yourself strikes me as deeply paradoxical. To use the language down here, where I reacted that, yeah, that is ironic. I dislike this slave trader, and I dislike his monologue, but I think he's also right. He says we find it paradoxical, which means bizarre, puzzling, that you would argue for both freedom, but also have slavery as a core system in your country. So you can do reactions like that where you write what's happening. You can just react with wow and words of reaction, language, emotional language. But fill this out in your own document. You'll submit this to me at the end of the week. All right, back to our slide with the stem. Sorry, let me find it here. This is your stem for today. Please check out the other video if you're confused about how to do the stem, and I'll see you tomorrow.